everybody.
Hello.
So last year was my first ever reading in front of people at Ghoulish. Since then I've read a bunch. Fortunate enough, my book just came out in February, The Spite House, and I've been reading from that a lot. And I figured in a room, I think entirely basically full of authors, in a selective setting here, I'm not going to read from The Spite House, because I love the book, but I've read my passages in The Spite House to the point of not exhaustion. I'm not going to sound that ungrateful, but thought I'd try something different, so I'm actually going to read from my work in progress, which has not been seen by my editor yet. So what you're hearing is definitely not going to be entirely this version of it by the time it gets hopefully published sometime next year. But it is a story that involves vampirism expanded into the demonic. It is titled Devils Kill Devils, and so I use the terms vampire interchangeably with various other terms, including devil, demon, worm, lots of animosity by my characters, certain characters towards vampires. You don't find that out until a certain point of the story exactly what's happening here. So, this passage, or part of it that I'm going to be reading from, explains why maybe just going out and killing vampire hunting, as it is often portrayed in a lot of works of fiction, doesn't necessarily apply in my story, with an incident where we're going to get into some of the background on vampires, but also some details about something that went very poorly in an endeavor to kill some vampires. Every member of the family was related not by blood, but by tragedy. They'd all lost someone to a vampire, and some of them, like Myra, had lost everyone. They were of different nations, ages, and backgrounds, and had passed through various encampments full of similarly nomadic and victimized individuals before settling at the Babyhead Mountain Refuge, but were unified in grief and a niggling, unspoken hope for revenge, even if it came by proxy. When the trio of vampires nested in the old Fredericksburg tunnel came to their attention, Duncan was the first to broach the subject of finally going on the offensive. Previously, any action they took was similar to that of other encampments, sporadic search and rescue operations where saving 1 out of 3 lives was viewed as a success, and trading one of your own to save a stranger's life was considered acceptable. What more could you expect? These things were harder to kill than many stories made them out to be. The older accounts made it clear that sunlight was a distraction at most. Yes, they preferred the night, and if skilled enough, could harness and weaponize darkness, but they were hardly restricted to it. As far as most scholars could tell, vampires like to operate between sundown and sunrise because that was when most of their prey slept, and why work harder than necessary? When Myra first read this, it startled her how much it made sense. Most predators conserve energy whenever and however they can. Religious artifacts were only as effective as the ardency of belief in both the person warding off evil and the evil itself. Garlic, dogbane, hawthorn, and other horticultural repellents were unpleasant to them, sometimes causing brief shocks to their biological systems. But they would suffer through any ill effects of each if they were determined to get to you. A stake through the heart was just one step of one possible measure that wasn't guaranteed to work and was usually most effective on the very young and unseasoned among the undead, who tended to sleep far more soundly than their elders. It was done primarily to pin the vampire in place, preventing it from fighting back as effectively during additional measures of execution and disposal: beheading, removal of the heart, burning the separated parts and then scattering the ashes, or mixing them into an elixir, or mixing the ashes into grave soil to reinter with the unburnt bones. It was also far more effective when driven through the heart and into the ground while the vampire was face down, which presented the added challenge of getting the damn thing into a prone position. Even then, depending on the demon's age and learned capabilities, it might not subdue them for long enough for you to complete the other tasks. Through the texts shared by Epizelus, the family learned that steel placed near the back of the vampire's tongue, or more ideally, nailed through the tongue, was a more potent paralytic, but also obviously far more difficult and dangerous to attempt. In fact, the metallic, almost platinum appearance of the vampire's teeth was actually a facade meant to sow doubt as to the effectiveness of this method. After all, if they had metal teeth, surely they were accustomed to metal being in their mouth. The fact that they had developed this veneer actually spoke to how effective piercing or even pricking the base of the tongue could be, provided it was done precisely. Other tactics centered more so on imprisoning vampires in a grave, burying them at a crossroad, hoping they were religious enough in life to believe that they were at the crossroads when they awakened, and were too afraid of accidentally taking the road to hell to wander off. This was typically only temporary, staving off any threat posed for a generation or two before the monster fully accepted this was only a trick and broke free. Some were buried with sickles over their throats or consecrated padlocks securing their feet. More deception or psychological torment that was better at menacing novice vampires to stay in place than actually keeping them in place. Even if they were never to learn this on their own, all it took was a visit from one of their friendlier kith and kin, as the clergyman Montague Summers once put it, to remove the obstacle to their freedom, or tell them that it was less of an obstacle than they believed it to be before moving on. The family understood all of this, but Duncan, his brother Graham, and his cousin Rowan had a hatred born from seeing their original family butchered that lurked like a landmine from World War I, still waiting to fulfill its purpose. Everyone who called the Babyhead Refuge their new home would be angry forever, but these three carried a fury that would burn them out if they couldn't find a release for it first. It took them 3 or 4 months to convince most of the family to even think that hunting a vampire was possible. After another 4 or 5 months of scouting and preparation, during which they witnessed everyone from homeless men to wealthy widows equalize as food for the unliving, the majority of them felt not only confident enough to see the hunt through, but believed it was necessary. 20 of them were selected of the 33 family members who volunteered to go to the tunnel. They included Myra, Duncan, Graham, Rowan, Ines, Dot, and Lynn, as well as others. They went armed with survivalist multi-tools that tripled as axes, shovels, and hammers. They had steel anchoring spikes, metal and wooden stakes, gasoline, and matches. Dogbane and hawthorn, which were stronger than garlic. And they had 2 people thought to be well practiced enough with spells to ensure the operation's success, Rowan and Ines. The magic was of utmost importance. Approaching the cave at dawn, they planned to softly sing what amounted to a powerful, prayerful lullaby, meant to place the vampires in a fog of sleep that made them unable to differentiate between wakefulness and dreaming. It was, they thought, the surest way to prevent the devils from hearing their attackers coming before they even set foot in the tunnel, and then waking to defend themselves. The younger thralls, in particular, were supposed to be susceptible to the lullaby, given that they were barely over a year into their new state of being. If you weren't a devil yourself, confronting a devil while they were fully alert and capable was offering yourself up on a plate. Some form of subterfuge and cunning was necessary. Even with that in mind, the 20 members of the raid understood that they might lose 2 or 3 people of their group before it was over, even if things went well. Right away, instead, things went wrong. Much of the earlier discussion and planning had been about whether to try to kill the older vampire who Epizelus, in his limited contribution to the cause, had confirmed was partly crippled by an ailment new and rare enough to even debilitate a vampire: radiation poisoning. Epizelus did not disclose how this old worm contaminated himself, feeding on disappeared citizens in the aftermath of Chernobyl, decades earlier from workers at a nuclear plant in the Russian town Kishtim, or later drinking the blood of patients in Spain or Panama after incidents there. Every bloodsucker who learned from those who fell ill dining on survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings knew that this new imbecilic atomic god that the humans had unleashed should not be touched, much less imbibed. But certain devils were closer to being humans in this sense. You could give them all the information and evidence they would need to make the right decision, and they'll still make the wrong one. Whatever brought him to his comparatively crippled condition, the senior centuries-old vampire was less imposing than he otherwise would have been. So Duncan and the others considered trying to kill him first. Without a proper layout of the deeper layers of the lair, however, there was no chance they could get to him before encountering the others. All they had were crude old maps drawn by earnest spelunkers from the early 1800s, which were helpful but not enough to base a riskier tactic on. From those maps, they had a sense of where the elder would position himself, but they could also gather this simply from what was most commonly done and what made the most sense. The thralls would act as sentries, positioned closer to the entrance, while the master, who had turned them, would rest in a deeper chamber. And while one of the maps pointed to a narrow crawlway that might give them access to this space, it couldn't be known if a small cave-in had since closed that path, or if that was more or less accurate than 2 other maps that did not show the passage. They entered the front of the old train tunnel carefully and never got a chance to stray from the unused tracks. Myra was part of the quadrant behind Rowan and Ines, so she heard them, but she did not see them. She never could pick out where their invocation went wrong, but she also wasn't versed in magics. Later, Rowan would say that Ines's voice quavered for 1 or 2 seconds, maybe even just half a second, and that's all it took. Actually, that was more than it would take for everything to fall apart. Then again, as Myra pointed out later, Ines never made it out of the tunnel to tell her side of the story. Only Rowan did. and none of the others had a good enough ear to identify which of them had made a mistake. Rowan's version of events might be the truth, or self-serving deflection laying blame at the dead. Either way, from what Myra knew of such things, when a spell relied entirely on words, not on any flames, animal bones, woodcraft, or anything else, then every single syllable had to be spoken with exactitude. A small break in your voice, a slight stutter or slurring of speech, a hiccup, the lightest cough, a stray bit of phlegm caught in your throat, or just a pinch of nervousness pulling your tone a note too high, that opened the door to catastrophe. Whatever had happened, Myra realized something was amiss when the entrance to the tunnel abruptly darkened behind them, like someone had rolled a massive stone over the opening. She withdrew one of the 10-inch spikes in her side pack. At the head of the group, Duncan called for them all to cluster together so no one would get disoriented, and turned around in the blackness. No one thought to turn on their flashlight, and it occurred to Myra later how strange it was to be so afraid of the dark, so afraid of what might be in it, that you in turn were afraid to turn on a light. Afraid enough to convince yourself that the light just might draw attention or illuminate something you'd be better off not seeing. Duncan's instructions were barely out of his mouth before a cloudy glow surrounded Ines. It took an extra heartbeat for Myra to realize it was not actually surrounding her, but emanating from her. It was a drained, lifeless color, and something made Myra think of it as an enslaved light, a stray spark shackled and stretched into a cold flame to be used for an occasion like this. Rowan had tried to continue the invocation, but Myra saw him turn to Ines and shriek when he saw her face. When Ines whipped around and faced the tail end of the group, Myra saw why he screamed and could not blame him, though her throat closed like a strangler's grip over any sound she wanted to make. Ines's eyes were closed, but her eyes were still visible behind the skin. The whites grayed, the irises red-rimmed, blackened to being indistinguishable from the pupils. She was unconscious and animated by an unseen force. One of the vampires, or all of them in unison, though it would have only taken one. Even in the earliest texts, descriptions of vampiric mesmerism never painted it as this horrific. Myra suspected it was because almost no one who had witnessed it survived to tell it, and the few who did were too terrified by the memory to write about it or driven too mad to write anything. Myra's own mind froze, assuming it was lost somewhere in the great blackness untouched by the heat of the stars, a space of immeasurable cold. By the time she broke free of it, Ines had already taken the spike from her hand and swung it toward her. Dot came from behind Myra, arms outstretched to stop Ines, screaming her name to wake her up. Ines drove the nail through the outer corner of Dot's right eye, and Myra immediately knew that the mission was a failure. The vampires had turned one of their own against them before they had gotten 10 yards into the tunnel. Rowan grabbed Ines from behind and tried to shout a new incantation, a possession banishment that would bring his friend back. I would have fucked up the spell. But his voice was sand, and even if it had been stone, the effort would have been futile. She broke his grip, slashed at him. He fell to the floor to dodge her, and instead of wasting effort on him, she moved to the woman to her right, Melania, and thrust the nail forward like a fencer's arm was attached to a mannequin, stabbing the older woman through the heart. Another man, Horace, tried to grab her from behind the way Rowan had. He was larger, and his bare hug on her might have been more effective if he'd ever been able to secure it. Instead, she reached back with her free hand without looking, the cracking of bone and snapping of tendon echoing in the tunnel as her arm turned over against the natural fulcrum of her shoulder, faster than humanly possible, and speared her fingers through the bridge of his nose and into his brain, killing him instantly. Rowan recovered enough from the shock to grab her feet, and Myra recovered from her own surprise to rush Ines and help to tackle her, along with Duncan, Graham, and a few others, pinning her to the ground. Duncan and Graham tried to shout orders. Rowan kept trying to pray. Some shouted they had to leave now, turn back immediately, while others tried to call for help for Melania and Horace as though they weren't already beyond help. Through it all, Myra pinpointed Lynn, who repeatedly asked, "What do we do?" as she cradled Dot, who was at least alive, still hands covering her injured eye. It's what they were all thinking, even though she was the only one saying it aloud. But it wasn't the only thought in their heads, not if they all had the same questions screaming through their minds that Myra had. Why did we come here? How do we get out? Rowan was sitting on Ines's legs. One person had each of her arms. Graham was holding her head like he feared she'd have a seizure, and Myra was draped across her torso. Ines didn't fight to free herself so much as she seemed to fight for an exit from her own body. She writhed and twisted in the grasp of her colleagues, and her bones and joints snapped in directions that weren't in concert with her movements. Her neck bones twisted and telescoped as she rolled her head back until it was upside down facing Graham. Myra could only hope that Ines was already dead through all of this. With a last echoing crack of her spine, Ines fell still, and the glow retreated to a place deeper within her. Before it faded, It gave Myra a glimpse of a grinning white face hovering just behind Graham's right ear, like it had a secret to share. The thing's smile was practically falling out of its mouth. Myra was just starting to warn him when the light completely died, and she was soon drowned out by Graham's bellowing scream that traveled upward, high above their heads. Though she could see nothing, Myra looked up toward the scream, which was overcome by the uglier sound of flesh being ripped far too easily. A drop of liquid landed in Myra's eye, just before a cascade of blood and bits fell to the ground as Graham stopped screaming.